Hi everybody, this is Bo Sanders, and I wanted to follow up to a couple weeks ago. I did a series about why things seem so bad right now. Today I want to talk about why we live in this fragmented and fractured culture. So 2 weeks ago we talked about how consumerism, globalization, and pluralism are kind of the three themes that people who are doing scholarship on such things, studying such things, are focusing on. Now, these three things are not in and of themselves problematic. It is the intersection of the three that is causing a tension, a level of conflict, animosity, confusion, contention that we need to address. And that's what I want to talk about today. So when we talk about things being fractured, one of the main thinkers on the issue is Alasdair MacIntyre. And whether you are sort of in his camp or you are combating his thought, he seems to be a person that is a hinge sort of voice character, and that his thought and scholarship, his approach, is a dividing line. It's sort of a threshold or a watershed, if you will. But he puts forward that this cultural chaos that we live in is because our communities are living in close proximity to each other. And because they each bring with them a narrative, the narratives do not always dovetail nicely. In fact, sometimes they don't even parallel. So we have these conflicting narratives. Each of them, and this is the important aspect of this line of reasoning, that each of them is a remnant from a previous era. So when he talks about the problem, he says that we have no rational mechanism or common arena in which to settle our differences. That our political conflicts, these either-or solutions, these different schools of thought that we are involved in, there is no common arena or agreed-upon mechanism for which to settle the dispute. Each of the perspectives claims to be impersonal or objective. So when you think about pro-life versus pro-choice, each claims to be impersonal, to have this great rationale behind the reasoning for why they do what they do, and that these conflicts cannot be resolved. So here's a quote from MacIntyre. "A key part of my thesis has been that modern moral utterance and practice can only be understood as a series of fragmented survivals from an older past. These are fragments of a conceptual scheme." So once you realize, if you buy into this, and you don't have to agree with it wholeheartedly, but once you acknowledge and account for the fact that every one of these issues that we try to examine is a remnant from a previous era, that it comes embedded with a set of assumptions or foundational beliefs, a narrative and practice, a community loyalty, or a sequencing of behaviors, and that every one of them is a remnant, a fragment, a fracture that is left over from a previous era, it shines an interesting light, and I believe actually opens up the possibility for a different approach as we head further into the 21st century. So when we talk about these traditions, one of the things that I have found helpful is to view them as enacted narratives. That when you believe a certain thing, whether it's about nationalism or the economy or religion or politics, that your behavior, you act your way into these narratives. And so they're a combination of the stories that we tell. Some are passed down from generation to generation. Some are stories we tell ourselves. Practices, how we actually behave, and relationships. It is these three things and how they are intertwined, stories, practices, and relationships, that form something we call traditions. And so whether that's cultural traditions, national traditions, religious traditions, whatever it is, they're a mixture of stories, practices, and relationships. And unless you account for and address all three of those, you will always be missing some element of the formula. So one of the things I like to do is talk about living traditions because they are like a plant. They take on a life of their own. And so I like to talk about being rooted in the tradition. And by the way, I'm a very Jesus-centric person. I have a very central Christology. And so Jesus used plant analogies a lot. And so I, even though many of us have moved on from an agrarian, farm-based society, I still like to use plant analogies. So I talk about being rooted in the tradition. This is my fourfold analogy. That you have the stem and structure of institutions that kind of hold the whole thing up and hold it together. And sometimes that becomes problematic, but you have to account for that. Then you have the leaves. And the leaves are how we interact with our surroundings, our atmosphere, how we breathe, and how we have interaction and transaction. And then the last thing is the fruit or the flower. What's the expression of a healthy plant or a sick plant? You'll know a tree by its fruit, Jesus said. So we're rooted in tradition. We have the stem and the structure that holds the thing up of the institution. The leaf is how we interact and have transaction with our environment or atmosphere, and then we bear fruit or flowers. So when we're talking about this fractured environment we live in, one of the people who has taken this and looked at it through one Christian perspective is Stanley Hauerwas. He incorporates the work of Alistair McIntyre, and so I'm going to read this. This is a case study that Hauerwas talks about. Life in a world of moral fragments is always on the edge of violence, since there's no means to ensure that moral argument in itself can resolve our moral conflicts. It's a little wonder in a hunger for absolutes in such a world, that we hunger for absolutes in such a world. It robs us of our sense of self or security that we have. I want to read that last part again. I didn't read that great. It is little wonder we hunger for absolutes in such a world that robs us of our sense of self or security that we have. And I think if you watch the news at all, you can see that this is an irrelevant idea, that people have been robbed of that security or that simplicity of the story that they tell. And so there is a reaction or a re-entrenchment of that often has us on the verge of violence. So I just want to end by posing a question and a possible answer. So the question is, our problem is that we live among fragments of past moralities, each with their own good reason, that are competing for our loyalties. This is a fascinating idea that if you were to step back, and none of us, we're all subjects, so none of us are that objective, but if you were to step back and try to outline or take a snapshot of the stories, the practices, and the relationships that have formed you and inform your current position, whether that's in politics or religion or culturally or nationally, that if you were to actually examine those things, it might be really interesting to see how there are multiple narratives all calling for your loyalty. Which is why we possibly, even as individuals and as communities and as a culture, a society, feel so conflicted and so fractured that we have this fragmented thing. We don't have integrity. Most of us do not feel as if life is a whole, an integer, but that it is partially this and partially that and partially this, and we are fractured or fragmented and not whole. We don't have a holistic approach. So we have these competing loyalties within us. And so what I want to talk about in the next video, and I blogged about this a couple weeks ago, but I'll make a short video about it, is the fact that there is no neutral anymore. It's just not possible. We live in a time where things are so saturated and the volume is turned up so high and the intensity has increased so greatly, exponentially, not incrementally, but exponentially, that the possibility of being neutral has been eliminated. And that inactivity is in itself an activity. That trying to be neutral is taking a position. So that's something I feel like we need to address. I would love to get your feedback on this fractured and fragmented world that we live in. I'll see you in the next video.